as an ex-student, don't get an opportunity to do enough, which is to welcome back my teacher at the AA, my fifth-year tutor here at the AA, Peter Cook, who has been with us as recently as last Saturday in the great conversation that went on for 4 or 5 hours here in this room on the little magazines of the 60s and 70s. We are this afternoon turning our attention to the here and now, which is the world that Peter always locates himself within. And the first of three talks in a series this term titled Architecture is Enough, which with Peter's activities I think has proven never to be the case. He's a constant force of nature. Architecture is never enough. He is always teaching, working, thinking, writing, promoting architectural culture around the world in a way that I think very few individuals anywhere in the world today can be thought of doing. As so many of you have come in this afternoon from down the road this way, perhaps at HOK, or up the road this way at a school that Peter directed from 1991 to 2005, and find yourself in this room, let me just say that that's the great lesson for many of us from Peter over the years, which is simply bringing people together, often in crowded settings like this, for a conversation about ideas, thinking, projects, personalities that really define architecture as we know it. That's what Peter has been doing for a great many years. His CV and biography, of course, needs no introduction, but his great gift from the time in which he created something like ArtNet in the 1970s, his collaborative work with his partners in Archigram in the 60s, his teaching and thinking before that, is simply a dedication to the bringing together of people to think about architecture, to spark conversations that form personalities and projects, which he's going to share with us in this series that starts today. Please let me thank Larry Malik and HOK especially for sponsoring this series and making it possible here at the AA. It means a great deal to all of us here that we're able to hold it in this setting and to welcome Peter Cook back to the series. Peter Cook. Thank you.
One of the satisfactions, I suppose, of being a teacher for a long time is that you see what happens to some of your former students, including picking up the cup of coffee that I thought I'd started drinking. Never mind. It shows ambition. And I think that for me, this particular room, let's get the old sob stuff over first. For this particular room, I've seen many battles and many experiences and know it quite well. The series is very deliberately referring to architecture from within because, and I think it's intended that there will be a second trio of lectures after Christmas, the subjects of which I have no idea at all. Just as one proceeds with other things, one has a pretty fair idea of what the next one will be and a very vague idea of what the third one will be. Because that keeps it hopefully from getting stale. My reason for concentrating on architecture from within is, I suppose, a cri de coeur that in my own view, and this will not be shared everywhere in this building, I'm sure, in a sense, architectural discussion has been hijacked by people who call themselves architects or architectural historians, particularly architectural theorists, but actually, when you boil it down, aren't really very interested in buildings. They purport to be interested in buildings, but as soon as they really get going, you realize they're not. In fact, many of them don't really know what buildings do very much and don't wish to be told. Many of them certainly don't realize, I think, a central fact, which is that many of the reasons why good architects do what they do are, in a sense, tricks of the trade. They are things which a designer realizes might be an opportunity, or a device, or a trick, or something they might try. And the building takes on a form, even a perceived symbolism that you would never expect. But, of course, the theorists and the historians come along afterwards and say, obviously it was carrying through this this notion, this belief, this political position, this edict, this philosophical overtone. And of course, in fact, I think many architects, particularly in the United States in the last 30 years, have convinced themselves that the cart very definitely goes before the horse, and that in a sense, the building is the servant of these notions, and it doesn't really matter whether the loos work or the stair is in the right place at all. Now, I'm not going to spend the next 6 lectures describing where loos should go, but what does interest me as a fanatic in this area is that architecture, the actual stuff that we build or try to build or try to design, has such a richness of overtones, of mixtures of the pragmatic and the intellectual and the imagined and the, my God, what should we do now? And that's what interests me particularly today. I think this business of common sense sort of concerns me and interests me. I'm amazed how much bullshit is talked in reviews. And I'm by the way, I've always regarded myself, though it can be proved on paper that the bulk of my income, such as it is, has come from teaching. I've always regarded myself as a designer who somehow slips in and out of teaching and sort of post-rationalizes along the way. And that gives me my basis. When all is said and done, I'm interested in what the thing comes out being, what it looks like, and to a large extent, what makes it tick. And then you can build up some theory behind that. What interests me about common sense is how many very, very nice and bright, and some of them one's closest friends, look at a problem and miss the obvious. They miss the nose on the end of their face. And I'll come to that, I hope, in successive examples. And are probably, because they're bright and interesting people, are probably more fascinated by things that aren't on the end, not the nose on the end of their face, not even the, their face, but something that might be more fascinating, intellectual, complex, having overtones and undertones and asides and so on. And the bloody nose is still on their face, but they've missed that. So I start off with a drawing from a book by, I think, a Japanese or Chinese guy who used to work for the Smithsonian. I've forgotten his name, doesn't matter. I'm, by the way, a terribly bad historian. I forget dates and names. I've scribbled down a few things here, but they're probably wrong. But they'll be broad. It doesn't matter. And I don't think it matters that much. You've got to get the general feel rather more. So this is some Japanese arrangement of significant objects. And the question is what was going on in those drawings, which I don't fully, but the author is trying to demonstrate that there is a particular significance in the placement and observation of those objects. And therein lies the whole shebang, really. Do we take account of the placement or the intention or the carcass? And that's a nice naughty one, because suddenly it does the unthinkable. It's got something underneath the floor. Now, most of us think in very straightforward ways, and we say, there's the floor, there's the box, so to speak, and we discuss all of this. But then if somebody suddenly breaks the rules and says, just a moment, pick up the floor, there's something underneath it. You go, oh my God, how do we handle that? Because it's suddenly broken the rules. So there's a lot that can be drawn from that picture, but I will move on. Still in Japan, it's interesting that a wonderful guy who died a few years ago called Shinohara takes what is apparently a very, very simple proposition of 2 rooms, 2 spaces, one side by side, and then decides, for various reasons, that a piece will not quite play the game. It just decides to be more particular. It's in fact a bathroom, obviously, and maybe God knows what's behind the bathroom. These 2 little rooms will not play the game and will just decide to be eccentric. There's probably a common sense reason. There's certainly a common sense reason when you have a celebratory space, but one bit of it has got to be more celebratory than the rest. And it's a pretty easy solution to say, right, we know how to, whatever date this was, it's old, obviously, year 300, pretty old, and you could only do stuff like that with holes in it. So then they said, but we've got to celebrate, so we'll stick another bit on, and that will be where you celebrate, and the other bit will be where you sit watching the celebration, presumably. Now that's pretty common sense, pretty straightforward, and then the really interesting thing is there much more you can do with it? Well, you can make holes in the wall, so the wall may contain the most interesting parts, and Marcus Cruz, who's a friend of mine, has just finished his doctoral dissertation on the whole subject of the secret rooms, well, not the whole subject, it's actually just a piece of his, on the secret rooms in Le Corbusier-Grandchamp. You can go right down, one could have a whole, I'm not going to bore you with it, but have a whole afternoon discussing the degree to which this is actually part of interest, and this is very obvious. And I think there's no dichotomy there. I think it's possible to say, nose on face wise, it's clear what that building is doing. There is the main foregathering space, and there is the special apse. Or you can go off onto the discussion of what is the game being played between the hierarchy of the windows. Or you can go on a conversation which says, what is the roof doing? Is it contributory or just keeping the water up? Is it in a sense, tectonically contributory, or is it really an inside building with whatever roof you care to think of? Or, what was going on there? Now, those of us who buy sort of appliances know that if you buy something that's in sort of cast plastic that has a thing like that, it's waiting for you to slip something into it and take it out. But this is a bloody church, so it can't be that. And things like, if you are a designer, and you're just interested in stuff, that is much more fascinating than whether this is sort of, Mesopotamian influenced, or, whether the popes were ruling. Or to me, if you're a designer, that is fascinating. It almost becomes in real. What can you do with a piece of substantive building which has a funny slot, which has a slot in the slot? To me, that's interesting. And if you work back from that to what might have been going on in society at that time, maybe that's interesting too. So we can, I realise that I've already spent 5 minutes on that rather boring slide, so I better move on. And there's all sorts of things that you might read into this. The historians will presumably tell you that there were certain observances of the church at that time, that there were certain abilities that people had with stonework, that the people prayed at the altar in a certain kind of way. Great, that's the brief bit. Having just critted an airport this morning. Yes, that's the bit, planes come in and they go out and people have suitcases. We know that. But what does the building do with it? Did it take advantage or not? And where was the interplay between the two? Wren did lots of city churches. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good. And he obviously had lots of different sites, as architects do. What is interesting to me is not whether he was sort of second-rate neoclassic or third-rate neoclassic, but how he handled a fat site, a thin site, a site where you could put the tower on the end, a site where you couldn't put the tower anywhere, a site where you might put the tower on the top, and then how he represented himself to the king or anybody else is of interest to others, but not to me. And it's interesting, I in another lecture, drew attention to the fact that Scogin, Elam, and as they were then, Scogin, Elam and Bray, who were rather good architects in Atlanta, and Scogin even made it to be the chair of Harvard for a while, so they mustn't be dismissed. In fact, they're rather good architects and nice people. But what's interesting to me is, in the other lecture, was that they found it necessary, when they published their book, to drag in all sorts of very fashionable architectural writers who clearly weren't very interested or being a bit secretly sniffy about Elam, Scogin and Bray's work, because they used to be commercial. And therefore, this book had quite good high second-rate buildings, but with this sort of bullshit that had nothing to do with it. And I felt irritated by that. I'm using them today for a completely different reason. I'm not showing you I don't think I'm showing you what the building looks like. I'm simply saying it as an arrangement. It's fascinating, whereby they do one of the old traditional things, which is to have a piece of the building which has the main activities of storage or manufacture or whatever it might be. And then the ancillary block, where you pee and prepare delicate things and so on. And then they celebrate it, almost church-like, with this sort of special object. And then suddenly say, we didn't put the whatever it might be in. So we'll make that part of the celebration. So this is a series of sort of strange tectonic moves that are like as if they were getting bored with themselves. Instead of just putting the fat block next to the thin block and saying that's it and a flash gap in between, they celebrated the flash gap. Then having done that, they got axial about it. I will come back on lecture 3 about the American fascination with the neoclassic. Now, here's a good building. It just has a fat bit and a thin bit. And the suspicion, if you're in the architecture game, I don't know how many of you really are, how many of you would have suspected quite correctly, I think, that the thin part is probably 2 floors and the fat part is 1 floor. Now, what interests me is that we can take that as read and we can say there's a little bit of sort of styling going on there. The architect has decided to pull this little bit back. Very nice. And probably not much more to say about it till I show you the fact that it's a famous building. Now suddenly we go into another loop, don't we? Ah, my God. Oh, yes, of course it's Peter Behrens, who wasn't trained as an architect, but had people like Gropius and Le Corbusier working for him, so it could be no slouch. But my God, now we have to look at it differently. And suddenly we talk about its symbolism and its position in history and you know, what Behrens represented, because he probably had good gift of the gab or something. And I have a suspicion that they were rather cleverer versions of 2 and 1 in high space and low space, probably in places like Chicago. But this is Behrens, so we take it seriously. You see? Now, I've got funny slogans in this one. I'm not sure I'm going to perpetuate the idea of having funny slogans. But I thought I'd try, because I usually never do. How do we challenge common sense? Do many of us, unable to resist, have a religion, by which I don't necessarily mean a churchy religion, I also mean certain architectural religions? Or do we have ways of going about things because they're the ways all our peer group goes about things, the ways that are correct to go about things, the way that if you go to a certain school, you must go about things? Are they the greatest danger to common sense? You don't see the nose on the end of your face because we are not talking about noses this year, kind of thing. I'm amused by this because it's a very straightforward issue. The picture was made to make a kind of statement about social patterns, but in fact it's also a very interesting architectural problem, and this picture throws it back on its back. Instead of having the pre-existent building and then saying, oh my God, we seem to have all these appliances, if you just stick the appliances there and then wonder what the implications of the building are, it becomes a very interesting both notion, problem and architectural issue. I doubt whether there's anybody in the room, even the 2 gentlemen in the front row, who would know who did this. It's actually Goldfinger. Erno Goldfinger, of all people, playing with prefabrication. Now, we tend to think, again, Erno Goldfinger is one of those names that is just beginning to be fashionable again, and it might even amuse the lady there who's gone to sleep, that he is admired for the Trellick Tower, which is a very tall tower in West London. Solid, and Goldfinger himself was a bombastic, amazing, bombastic creature. But he played with something as finicky and impermanent as prefabricated housing, which was a very sensible way of dealing with the issue, as the IKEA company has now discovered. We've come in 50 years sort of full circle to now it's okay to discuss prefabricated housing if you buy it from IKEA. Why not have people who are quite good architects like Goldfinger doing it? So already in preparing the slides, there was a certain moment about a week ago when I thought, well, am I really not talking about common sense? Am I talking about just having a good idea? Is there a difference between the two? Is it the difference between saying the nose is on the front of your face and your nose is running? A good idea is to wear a scarf, kind of thing. Or do I like scarves, you see? Or is the problem really knitting a better scarf? Have you lost the fact your nose is running because the scarf becomes a more interesting conversation? If you were embattled, I don't even know where all these castles are. They're various funny places, but clearly there were rather unfriendly people in the district, and so you hid inside the walls. Wherever you were, here's different people somewhere else in the world hiding desperately behind the walls, except that they've got a... What's interesting is to read back from the architecture and to notice that this group of people probably had somebody much tougher sitting on top of them, whereas these people were effectively making a little sort of town inside the walls, so that although there was clearly somebody with power, money and influence who could afford a dome, but the rest of the people were, there was a sort of hierarchy of rather other activities, you know, the local mobile shop or whatever it might have been in the time, whereas here they all appear to be rather more under control. So secondary, and here there are a lot of them, though the basic requirement was the same, that there were lots of unfriendly people outside there trying to get at you, so you scampered in within the walls. But this is, of course, becomes a sort of proto-city here. We have not only the person and their army protecting you, but a whole lot of other individuals within, so that it's common sense has to adapt according to the size and the nature of the problem. And then we come into the digital world, where we are able to assess far wider range of problems. And it is to be hoped, and I'm not in any position to know, it is to be hoped that the appropriateness is of the same order as it was in the last three examples. Because in the last three examples, it seems to me that the devices were very appropriate. You built a bloody great wall, so that sorted out the first problem. You then sorted out other secondary things within. And then we try in our great wisdom, with increasingly sophisticated means available, to suss out what are the real pressures of cities, what are the real potentials, and what I find slightly curious is that the consistency of the diagram. Does that mean that only one criterion is being measured? And yet we know, the city dwellers, that there are many, many criteria that impinge upon our activities and our responses. But this diagram seems to be very much the same sort of sugar cubes, which is why I found the last Venice Biennale extremely tedious. But if Zaha's doing this stuff, it's got to be all right. Zaha in our office are doing that kind of stuff. So I hope that she and her friends are taking into consideration as many criteria as possible and are prepared for the fact that many of them may be both inconsequential or contradictory. And I think that really, really good architecture is also able to handle the contradictions. It is, after all, common sense. It does involve discrimination. Or does it? Is there a conflict between common sense and discriminate sense? If we discriminate, do we begin to weigh, and the things that come first to us as responses may not be the most well considered? And what is the difference between composition and consideration? Composition, after all, is a self-conscious act, is a self-conscious weighing up. I think all these things are related. I don't have a solution to it, but I think it's worth consideration. I think it is essentially a series of issues that come from within the territory of design. And architecture, for me, comes from design. This is Cedric Price in a not absolutely typical diagram supporting the Fun Palace, which is a sort of jokey diagram with clowns and media vans with media van written on them, which I think is perfectly legitimate kind of architectural drawing, actually. I think if a media van is a media van, and if you didn't know that, you might think it was a bread van and get it all wrong, so you label it a media van. Now, I don't know how many of us, you know, I've lived through a period both in this school and in the Bartlett where most people I knew would rather be seen dead than label something. You know, they would go to extreme contortions of sort of numbers that you couldn't see and references and look on page 109 and, well, you know, that's a question, digitally remote things. But if a media van is a media van, it's a media van. And I think that's all right, bit of writing. And Cedric, of course, made a virtue of this. He made a virtue of the kind, you know, even I hardly would like to be seen dead using a pentel, but he didn't mind. And I think it almost became an ethos. This is a sort of matter-of-fact drawing, consciously matter-of-fact, consciously saying that if you do it like this, is a common-sense way of approaching. There are, of course, devices that were so common sense that they then, in the right hands, became deified. The idea of saying that a certain piece of the building operates at a different level of intensity and is absolutely essential to the rest of the building. Therefore, it has a special place. The idea of the service tower and the access tower, and they both organisationally and to some extent physically support the rest of the building, is such an obvious idea. You know, carrier bag needs handle. Great, no problem. You know, shoe needs laces. Great. It's about at that level, actually. I mean, it became, you know. And the same with making holes in buildings. I'm fascinated. I've had for 40-odd years, maybe 50-odd years, however long, a paranoia about windows, holes in walls. You make a wall with a roof, hopefully, or the wall becomes a roof if we're really exciting, and then you have to make a hole in it, usually, very often. I've leant over backwards. I've been dying to do a building which didn't really have to have windows, that somehow the wall would become window gradually and return to being wall gradually, that you could edit it out. But most of the time we're preoccupied, and in fact in many buildings that's all there is really to consider. How nicely do they do the windows and doors? Not much else to talk about. If you are early days Herzog and de Meuron, and of course, as those of you who've heard me before will know, one of my great giggles of the last 10 years is how if we put the clock back about 10 years, a room such as this would be full of people who would be wanting desperately to do a Herzog and de Meuron building, deifying a certain kind of gentle, Swiss, layered, cool, calm, straight-edge thing. And then the buggers went on the wobble. Suddenly, from the point at which they did their entry for the Extension of Museum of Modern Art about, 9 years ago, whenever it was, they started twisting things. And these guys were left, sort of. Or they had to twist, they weren't quite sure why. And I love things like that. I love it when heroes suddenly, and I haven't ever had a conversation with, I'm dying to have a conversation with one and say, come on, did you just get bored? Because I would have done, but I'm not you. Did you just say, look, we can be cleverer than that. We've done that, been there. Let's not go to Brighton again this weekend. Let's go somewhere else. Which could be a common sense attitude. But, nonetheless, having said all that, this is quite a good way of dealing with windows, which is to sort of pretend they're not there because it's just air that's coming through and lighting a room. It's fine for a gallery. And actually, it's too cool for me, but I rather like it. I have to admit that it's a great way of dealing with the problem. Even this is an even greater way. Now that's a funny old building to have, a funny little old brick sort of building, small windows, ordinary trees. I don't know how many of you in the room know it. For those of you who know it, you know what's coming next, but it's a little bit like the Gropius plan, the Berend's plan story. This is just some funny little old brick building in Northern Europe with a window that seems to have got uncomfortably close to the ground, thereby letting creepy crawlers in unless it's well detailed. Or is it? It's actually, of course, Sigurd Leverance, who we honour and is an amazingly good architect. It's actually the interesting thing about those windows is that when you're in the room behind the windows, you are sitting waiting in a waiting room, and there is a bench which waiting for the clergyman in Sweden, probably is a long business. You sit on the bench, and as you sit on the bench, your head is exactly in line with the sill, and the sill is in line with the field behind it. You get this absolutely beautiful tectonic trick, which is that you just by naturally sitting there, common sense is you're going to be looking, there's nothing much else to look at, and there's this field. Tadeo Ando cribs the same idea in Vitra. The other thing is that, of course, up there in middle Sweden, you get a lot of gloomy times and gloomy days, and Leverance's ability to control light is fantastic. And we see even those things that look as if they might be chimneys are not chimneys, they're actually just light holders. So common sense gets pretty dark up here. Let's do something to cheer these people up before they go into the main church. He then does another thing, of course, which is on the floor of the main church. He plays silly buggers with the floor, so that it's slightly... But that's another story. So I think sometimes devices are carrying through a subconscious battle with the normalness of the opening. And after all, even if you do flowies like Lars Spoybrook here of Knox, somewhere along the line somebody wants to open up. And where do you put it? I find this amusing because I have a suspicion that there are probably functional reasons why it's put precisely there. And it's sort of, it still looks sort of funny. It looks sort of gawky, sort of like, should it be longer or should there be two of them? Maybe there should be three, or we've gone to all the trouble to do one of these, but we've still got the age-old problem, where do you bloody put the opening? He's done this as well because he's sort of managed to get the rest of the building to start to move towards it and acknowledge it. But still, it is an incredibly difficult problem. Whether you do this kind of thing or his kind of thing. There is this question of opening. Somebody interesting, I always find Pelzig fascinating, because he does something that I would have never been able to do because of being nervous, which is that he takes this buttress condition and he takes the normal shed condition, I think it's a chemical works, and puts a similar kind of opening in both. Most of us normally would say the buttress, which is probably carrying a stair or something, has one type of window, and the big shed, even though it's the end of it, has another kind of window. He says, no, it doesn't matter what's going on with the walls. We need an opening, we put the opening. That's nice, that's cool, in my view. And Colin, sitting here, he will remember that we really wanted, on the left here, to do several of these conditions where we would have done more with the business of the skin progressively melting, so that there is an orifice, but it's not really an orifice. Again, it's this remembered paranoia with trying to beat the window at its own game as an idea. To what extent that's common sense or very walking into trouble, I'm not quite sure. And there's another project of mine owned on the right, where on a rather larger scale, where I was suggesting the same notion that the whole tower would be a series of greater or lesser degrees of translucency, and therefore there would in effect be a lot of window, but no particular place where there was a window. And since we are involved in such things from time to time, as you know, common sense suggests that you have a lot of people sitting around the pitch, and you have to get the buggers out, so you have lots of stairs leading down. And we don't seem to have moved any further forward in 2,000 years, because that's the nature of the problem. Or, you know, ways of having some people doing something amusing and a lot of people watching them doing the amusing thing. Doesn't seem to have moved much in probably 2,500 years. Until you get a sort of eccentric situation. Now again, you have to look rather carefully here. If you look rather carefully at the Malmö Theatre, which was also it's a long, complicated story, but Leberantz, the same Leberantz as the window, he also worked on this project, except that they screwed him around a lot. But anyhow, it has, when you go there, when you look at it, an extremely wide stage. Really, really wide. It's got some flaps that come in and out, but it's got an extraordinarily wide stage, an extraordinarily large amount of proscenium. Strange one. Because Ingmar Bergman was a director there, and he was already making films, and he wanted a stage that wasn't really a normal theatre stage. He wanted one that with the camera, apparently the camera angles that were available at the time, such that he could actually film inside that theatre. Once you know that, it's common sense. Bit of a problem here, Ingmar. You know, you won't be able to you're going to see the side walls. I have the solution. And you make the thing wider. It's lovely. I like things like that. They're so banal and they're so marvellous. And if you're a good architect, they become the salt of the earth. They become you can really get off on some fucking bloody theatre guy who wants to make films. You know, that's breaking the rules, but let's see what we can do, Ingmar. You know? There we are, we can do that. Okay. And then subsequent generations sort of say, well, we don't really need to wire, so we'll have to make a screen. And then some very clever people come on and say, I've got something where we sometimes use the screen and we sometimes don't use the screen. I like that too, you know. The one rolls over the other. I like that. So is common sense matter-of-factness, or is it to do with circumstance? This is done early on Sunday morning. If you live in the part of London that I do, or the parts of London that many of you probably do, a very typical thing in London is the corner block, the corner mansion block, where you have to maintain the street facade, and then, you have all sorts of stuff poking in and out around the back. In fact, London is very keen on keeping it nice and sort of bourgeois on the front, but letting it all hang out at the back. And you do things with sort of toilet windows, and having recently worked on a housing competition, I know this whole business of ventilating the toilet and all that stuff it hasn't gone away, let's say. And if you were in a certain sort of part of northern Europe, you would then, including London sometimes, you would put a tower on the corner building. And you didn't want them to notice the back, you wanted to notice the front, or perhaps you wanted to sort of anyhow. And then, but it is a central problem to mansion block planning. And it's no different if you were Gaudi, really. But when we go to Gaudi, if we go sort of with camera in hand, and we're fantastically interested in the voluptuousness of the thing, and the tiling, and the funny-shaped windows. But basically, Fred Gaudi had just the same problems as somebody up the Finchley Road. How do we get that bloody toilet ventilated, and can we make something of it? Because he was rather good, it's reasonable to say, he did rather more with it than Joe Bloggs. And then, of course, this is the bit, and I've deliberately not shown a pretty picture version, kept it architectural. He knew about how far to go, pretty far, of course, with the subsequent stuff. And I like that. I like the fact that basically it's a bloody mansion block, you know? But what can you do with the same problems and formulae? What can you do with a building that has, you know, a modern building, recent years, columns, toilets, staircases, emergency staircases, escalator, columns. Pretty straightforward. Could be any shopping mall in the Western world. Till you know it's not. You know it's, no, it's a famous building because we missed the periphery. But you take the periphery away, it's your bog standard stuff. I was brought up in Ipswich, and I remember what Ipswich was like before this building happened. And when I went back to see it with this building, I could not, it was as if something had landed from Mars in bloody wrong end of Ipswich. This thing dropped there, before Ipswich was as posh as it is now. It dropped there, and it reflected this sort of second-rate English town. But when push comes to shove, it's absolutely normal stuff. Escalator up the middle. I could see you grinning. You knew what was coming, right? Good head of architecture school can spot the deliberate mistake. You probably know this one too. Another bit of problem, back into Nordic parts. Got a bit of problem here, Squire. We've got this old law courts, and got to get all this stuff shoved on the side. Thinks about it, actually thought about it for years, but according to the things I've read, he spent most of the time pissing around with the elevation. The elevation really worried him. What he did inside, just sort of thought, well, the courtyard, let's do a sort of a number between the courtyard and an internal courtyard. And Aspelin produced an absolutely stunning building, but from very common sense presuppositions. You know, you stick your courts on the back, give them a bit of styling. You have a really good central space for all those nervous people who've done a bit of a dodgy. And go to a lot of bother with the lighting of it. In fact, one of the paradoxes, I think, of this section is that when you look at it at first, you think, ooh, did we have control of this and that and something else? But actually, as the result, dealing with that difficult Nordic light is, I think, one of my sort of top 10 buildings of my experience. It's extraordinary what you can do with a simpler proposition. Well, another of my silly Sunday morning. One of this, I don't know, a lot of you are not from England, so I will tell you that an old English expression was, put it under your hat. But here's a bit, put it under your hat. Keep it. Well, what I actually, of course, mean is the architectural version. Out in Australia, some former students of mine found that they were having to put various bits of local tat. So they put up a hat, and then the tat goes under the hat. So there's another, I can't remember what this one is, I'll go quickly past. Jean Nouvel, on a slightly larger and more heroic scale in Switzerland, has a whole series of performance buildings and so on, and simply sticks them under his hat. Wonderful. It's great. And then if you examine it more carefully, you can see that the way it's tucked under the hat, but the hat is definitely exaggerated, because the hat, to say it's all there, guys, I haven't got the right accent to say how he would say it, but it's all there, guys, come in and discover, and you'll find it all laid along. I like things like that. Of course, Mies in the Crown Hall in Chicago said, it all goes under the hat, so long as it's rectilinear. No room for fun and games here. There's another, sorry, it's a download, this photo, but Niemeyer in Sao Paulo at the Biennale building has a marvellous long, in fact there are two hats on the screen. There's the long box hat, and another wonderful one, which maybe I'll come back on a later date, which is this, something that in England you'd have great difficulty getting away with, because it would appear to be wasteful. But it's just an enormous slab of concrete. Somebody's going to say, what does it do? And the answer is not very much, except keep the sun off. It's vast. It does. That links up a few buildings, but it's a vast, and there's a few people skateboarding, rushing to the restaurant at the end, but otherwise it does all except stop the sun coming down. Wonderful, wonderful. If only we could do that. But it's the central box that it is an exhibition building. It's where the Biennale is held, and it has to be very large, easily serviced, car park at the back, straightforward, common sense building. How are we going to access the upper level? Bit of a problem there. No, it's the best part. Just, you have this one stonking, wonderful, extraordinary ramp. And I can speak with feeling there, because my exhibit was just on the top end of the picture. It was really difficult, to, however smart you think you are, to think of anything that is remotely as smart. Niemeyer had done it. You know, there is this absolutely so you have this almost negative building, and then woo, no messing around. I love that. I mean, it's kind of called there's another English expression, holding your horses. You hold your horse and you do this wonderful thing. I like straight people who do some. Here's a bit of a thing, bit of a river or gully or something, and what an opportunity to cross it, right? Bridges and all that stuff. And we don't have the balls these days to do anything that's as interestingly opportunist as these guys did, where they said, what an opportunity to have a bit of extra town. You know, why not? Great, I love it. Slightly more eccentrically, a man who, as far as I'm told, almost built nothing else, though he was a big influence in Brazil, Amancio Williams, who is reported as having made the interiors of the Le Corbusier doctor's house as well. He put a house on a bridge. So there was an opportunity grasped. Is that common sense, or it's not what most people would do? So here we're into a funny subplot again. What's the difference between common sense? Of course, there you got a bridge, so you might as well put a house on it, no problem. But most people would not do it. It is not the done thing, except it was done in London Bridge. And I'm amused that, I think I've got another picture. Oh no, yes. Amancio Williams must have been into bridges, because here is an absolutely absurd notion. You have a bridge and you put an airport on it. You put an airport on an enormous concrete structure. And then, opportunities, why not stick the road underneath, since you've got the bridge? Anyhow, most people would not think of doing that. And so what I suppose is a subplot to a subplot today is to suggest that if you have both a mixture of sort of oddball common sense and idea, you sometimes do the unthinkable, but having done it, it makes sense. It's just that most of us don't have the balls to do it. Here we are back with Amantha Williams, and a funny thing, I couldn't resist putting this in at the last minute because there's some funny character there who's decided to, I don't know what she's doing, but she sure as hell can't cross the gully by going along there. What makes she go around? But she's sunning herself or something. It's such a bad photograph, you can't quite tell, but I like things like that. I like sort of strange evidence of life. Or here's somebody much more recent, forgotten who they are, doing exactly the same thing. Once we have a building over a gully, why not make it as a bridge? Same as Amantha Williams, except the bridge doesn't look very easily climbable, which leads me to suspect, my God, that they were more interested in the figuration than they were in what it was doing. But maybe and interested in figuration rather than what it's doing, because we can take some, and this is an oldie, this is the Chicago Tribune competition, and discuss that very few of them seemed to be very interested in what it was doing, but they had a lot of fun along the way, whether they were Adolf Loos or somebody into Indian tops, or there's a lot of famous names there. So a lot of architecture is spent having fun along the way. But in terms of matter of fact, I think there's also the celebration of the architect who was brilliantly matter of fact and just somehow had mannerisms that took it to high art. And this is Irving Gill, of whom much is written and rather few buildings survive, who could take the sort of influence of the simple American mud building but brought to its sophistication. He was actually trained as an engineer, and then just by simple placement could take it to high art. Another English expression, sorry, this is bearing in mind that many of you are not from our damp country. The phrase, it's in the bag. We've got it sorted out, it's in the bag. And in last 15 years, I have been inundated with students, most from outside Europe, who have been fascinated to come and learn how to do capsules. I suppose they remember that Archigram did capsules, and then they went out of fashion. Now they've come back into fashion, and they want to do capsules. The question is, what is a capsule, and what can you do with it? And is it a common sense way of dealing with it? Is it like putting everything in the bag? Let's collect that, put it in the bag, in the bag, in the bag. But it's a capsule bag, meaning it's a capsule bag. Well, a former student of mine in Germany, Gert Stockman, who taught here for many years, and his partner, they put cows in capsules. Seemed a good idea at the time, or it was a good art idea at the time. Some very boring people somewhere in Germany put it in a very boring, clumpy capsule, so it doesn't have to be a nice capsule. And Neil Denari, who I think is an extremely good and interesting designer, puts things in a sort of capsule, but then gets very involved in the design of the capsule and works over it until it becomes, it almost is on the borderline of losing the original idea. But I do like to mark the fact that I think it was he, Neil Denari, who was the first person to do that. I think the others have all imitated him. However nice they are and however famous. I just wanted to log that along the way. It's not strictly part of my theme today, but I couldn't resist. This is actually Wolf Pricks trying to suggest some common sense ideas. And I thought it's a bit eccentric. I mean, it's a bit different from most of his sketches, which don't usually have these sorts of writings on them. I just put that in. Some common sense gets extremely tedious. I think I'm the first to admit that nifty ways with folding. They try and grab you by saying, I got this amazing, sensible way of dealing with concrete panels, stroke paper, stroke rectangular bits, or whatever it might be. And then they get, was it worth the trouble? I don't mind when somebody takes a sort of plug-in idea and says, yeah, once you have a structure, you can stick anything in it. I mean, it makes my plug-in city look actually quite doctrinaire, because all my bits were sort of, whereas James Wine's stuck any old rubbish inside it. I think that, in a way, taking the idea much further forward. But it remains a good idea. I'm amused at what happens when we have the problem of adding a building to another building. Most of us try to have it on the end. If we're very daring, we put it on top, but that's difficult. We might run it off at right angles. We might, at a certain period, approximately between 1971 and 1983, have added it on at a 4-degree shift. What we might not have done is these couple of Belgians, is to do that with it, which is to enjoy the fact that it didn't quite. I have moved, it is not a common sense solution, you see, in any way. Well, it's a fairly straightforward building, but it's not a common sense solution. And I cannot help myself. I start off from the presupposition today that we underrate common sense in design. But I have to admit that I too get bored with common sense sometimes, quite often. Right? And I promise you, I always start off with the common sense idea. But I can't help thinking, yeah, that was a bit more interesting than just sticking the bloody thing on the side. You had the real Bernard Tschumi here, last night or the night before? I didn't know that when I put the lecture together. I'd forgotten, conveniently forgotten. I think Bernard is one of the best strategist architects I've ever met. I think his way of assembling, not only assembling information, but taking a logical procedure with it, is a form of common sense that very few other architects have. These diagrams, I think, came from the competition for the opera in Tokyo. And what Bernard simply said, I don't know whether he probably doesn't show this. Did he show it? No, it's too old. But he took a series of functions, said each of them will have one striation. And then they will dispose themselves along and simply have activity A, activity B, C, D, E, and you just layer them on like a striped tie. I think it's really cool to do that. Or in Fresnay, where he has to deal with this conglomeration of old buildings, and instead of sort of, digging up one and sticking something on the end of another, and he just says, let's drop the new stuff on top of it, and the interstitial space will become the magic, which it is. I think it's, again, one of the most brilliant observations. Colin and I, faced with a site that we knew well, Colin knew it even better than I did for personal reasons, but I'd been there about 8 times, often with students who were looking for somewhere to have a drink at 3 in the morning, as one does on student trips, knew that area quite well. And so when we were faced with the building, it became interesting because there was an obvious thing to do, which was to just fill in the available site and leave the hatch bit, which was the necessary fire route, the 2-meter fire servicing route. It's common sense. There's the site. Got to keep the other 2 buildings, bit of space, just put it in there, and keep a comfortable 2 meters away. And then we thought of having a skin and a pin, because we knew the site well enough, right? You knew, don't piss around, there's an obvious place you come in onto that site. It's from the corner, that corner there. You don't mess around. That's where they come across the bridge. That's where the tram stops. You come in there, don't mess about. And one stuck to that. And then you could do a bit of theatre going up into the unknown. And you could have surprise. So you went up the pin. There would be the theatre of surprise. And then, of course, there are all sorts of sub-things that you can do, having come to those decisions. So I would claim that a lot of the basic decisions on this building were just common sense, helped by the fact that perhaps we were sufficiently familiar with the site, that you didn't look for trouble. Oh, you got plenty of trouble in the process of building it, but you didn't look for trouble in terms of the basic decisions taken. Albeit that you can then, of course, along the way, suggest all sorts of other, sensible things that you're doing with the category, media platform, the delivery zone, the camera, whatever. But yeah. But, basically, skin and pin, coming on the corner. There you go. What is fascinating is that interstitial space. Would you agree, Colin? I mean, that the interstitial space is one of the best bits of the architecture. He's not. He's got no choice in the front row. And that actually, that thing that was the hold-off becomes... Now, of course, one cannot claim for it any more than it was that it was left over. It came about. And that is one of the frustrating and fascinating and wonderful things about architecture. And the things that the critics can never understand is that the real excitement as a designer and the thing you put in your back pocket or keep in your mind is these consequences. Consequentiality of straightforward moves made, certain responses, and then things that you didn't quite expect. You don't show photographs of the bit that didn't work, but you show certainly photographs of the thing that worked so much better than you would have ever expected. And the rest, I'm not here today to do a lecture about this building. And then I couldn't resist putting in a really bad scheme. I'm not a good historian, I don't remember names very well, but I don't want to remember who this is. It's very recent, and it was in a Serbian architectural magazine. I apologize to any Serbian who's sitting here, but it's a crapper from every conceivable point of view. There's something intersecting, something that the guy doesn't squat, he's got to get the circulation across the middle, and how's he going to do that? And then there's a room there you can't get into. He's got this sort of horrible straight up and down, and they just decide to have a bum at the end. It's wonderful in its horribleness. I couldn't resist it. So, blank and tight. We've been working recently on a building for Madrid, which I think is going to get built. We had a problem of a villa, a couple of blank walls to one side of it, and a very tight space around it. They are all the way down to Madrid. Villa, blanks, tight. There are people sitting here who worked on the project as well, so they can vouch for the fact that it was blank and tight. And there we are, there's the situation. Two very usefully blank walls. It's pretty tight. So we build on the tight by pretending it's a garden. We say, well, it is a garden, so let's make it a garden. And use the fact that the blanks can be built upon. It's straight common sense stuff. Then you spend days, weeks manipulating it, that's for sure. But basically you borrow also from Graz, and you say that 2 meter number, that wasn't bad. It seemed to be quite good to use this 2 meter. Let's use it again. Let's take advantage of it. Have a 2 meter running round. Fill up the blanks with stuff. And veg it, because it's a garden, isn't it? Remember, it's a garden, so you veg it, because it's a garden. It's not just a veg because we like We want to do a veg facade. It's a veg because it's a garden creeping insidiously up the building. Put a bit of water in between the two, and that's it. So, that is celebrating a common sense assessment of a situation. But are we celebrating the process, or are we celebrating the stuff which is celebrating the process? That, of course, is an architectural conundrum. Maybe the whole of architectural design is about this business of celebrating the process by the stuff. When they did the Houses of Parliament, they had a classicist, Barry, who they then hired a Gothicist, Pugin, who could make it look like something interesting. And it's really the sort of origin of the iconic building, of the modern iconic building. We want to wallow in our English Gothicism, but we want it sort of sensibly organised, which at that time meant classic. Well, who cares? Seems to do the trick. Or you can be like Sean Godsall in Melbourne, who wants to say that it's a very simple box and wants to make you intrigued that there might be something more to it than that. Can play the window when he wants to, pull the string, drop the window, and got you really guessing. Maybe it's the climate, maybe it's because I think that Melbourne architects are more interesting than Swiss architects. I think he does the Swiss thing, but with a wit that you can only do maybe with a ventilated building. But this is my view. So skin and pin is common sense, maybe. And actually, I'm nearly at the end, the Secession building by Olbrich in Vienna is actually a very sensible gallery. If you analyse it, lots of north light, lots of nice big spaces, coming off the street, bit of a vestibule. Actually, if I should have done the trick of just showing the plan first again. The only thing is putting a cabbage on top of it. Sort of just, you don't think of it being sensible once you put a cabbage on top. You think, and everybody talks about the cabbage, you see. But actually, if you look at the back bit, perfectly reasonable, north-lit, lantern-lit building with the decoration on the side. And I find that fascinating that it's visibly turning on mannerism, which other people might have done at the same time. It's decorating that central, simple proposition. But then to put the cabbage on, that's really provocative. But he's only really provocative with the hat. So he's prepared to use common sense, then decoration, then rhetoric. It's just that he's rather good at it that enables him to get away with it, I think. And finally, he really enjoyed himself when he got into Middle Germany, where perhaps the audience was less sophisticated than it was in Vienna. And anyhow, he had a very good time with making an